The mud was a cold, cruel kiss against the soles of her feet. Elara Thorne had long since stopped flinching at the sharp bite of stones or the slick slide of damp earth. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity, the last 3 miles of a journey that had already stripped her of everything but the clothes on her back and the mortifying purpose that drove her forward. Her destination was Beaumont House, a place she had never seen, to meet the man she was to marry, a man she had never liked. She had begun the day a lady, albeit an impoverished one. Lady Elara Thorne, daughter of a viscount whose lands had produced more debt than crop for 3 generations. She had possessed a fine, if slightly dated, travelling dress of deep blue velvet, a small reticule containing her late mother's pearl earrings, and a pair of sturdy leather slippers. Now the velvet was torn at the hem and smeared with grime, the reticule and its precious contents were gone, and the slippers were a distant memory, sacrificed to the mire 2 miles back. The highwaymen had been ruthlessly efficient. They had taken her meagre jewellery, the last of her pin money, and even the carriage itself, leaving her and the terrified driver on the roadside with nothing. The silence in the carriage before the attack had stretched thin, like old linen about to tear. Now, the only sound was the wet squelch of her own progress and the frantic beating of her heart. This was it, the culmination of her family's ruin. She was a sacrifice, a lamb being led not to a slaughter, but to a slow, gilded suffocation. Lord Julian Beaumont, the younger son of the late Duke of Beaumont, was her intended. She knew him from a handful of London seasons years ago, a man whose charm was as shallow as a puddle and whose eyes held a casual cruelty, but he had an allowance, and her family had nothing. The arrangement was a brutal piece of social arithmetic, her title for his coin. Her father had wept when he told her. A broken man, confessing that this was the only way to keep the roof over their heads, to provide for her younger sisters. Elara had not wept. Her tears had dried up long ago, evaporated by the constant, low-grade fever of anxiety that came with watching her family slowly disintegrate. She had simply nodded, her hope becoming a small, cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She would do her duty. She would marry Lord Julian. She would endure. Now, even that grim resignation felt like a luxury. How could she present herself like this? A beggar arriving at the gates of a ducal estate, they would take one look at her and send her away. Perhaps it was for the best. A sharp, clean rejection was surely better than the slow poison of a life with Julian. Yet the thought of her family, of her sisters' hopeful faces, pushed her onward. She could not fail them. She had to try. Through a break in the trees, she saw it. Beaumont House. It did not rise so much as it commanded the landscape, a vast edifice of pale stone with wings that seemed to embrace the rolling hills. Light poured from 100 windows, spilling onto manicured lawns where carriages were still arriving. An engagement party. Her engagement party. A bitter laugh, dry and soundless, caught in her throat. She was the guest of honour, and she looked like a wraith clawed up from the earth. There was no turning back. Squaring her shoulders, she forced her trembling legs to move, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the pristine gravel of the drive. She bypassed the grand entrance, knowing the footman would never permit her entry. Instead, she found a side door, a servant's entrance, leading into a stone-flagged corridor that smelled of beeswax and roasting meat. A young housemaid gasped at the sight of her, her eyes wide with alarm. "I am Lady Elara Thorne," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I am expected." The maid scurried away, and Ilara was left to stand in the echoing hallway, a muddy spectre in a house of light and music. She could hear the murmur of the party, the swell of an orchestra, the bright tinkle of laughter. Each sound was a fresh wave of humiliation. Her fingers tightened into fists at her sides. She was not a beggar. She was the daughter of a viscount. She would not cower. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, a stern-faced butler appeared, his expression a mask of pure disdain. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her bare, mud-caked feet. "If you will follow me," he said, his tone suggesting he was leading her to the gallows. He did not lead her to a private room to be cleaned and attended to. He led her directly to the edge of the grand ballroom. He stopped just shy of the doorway and announced her name in a voice dripping with contempt. "Lady Ilara Thorne." The music faltered. 100 heads turned. A collective gasp rippled through the glittering assembly. Ilara stood frozen on the threshold, the mud on her dress a brand, the cold of the marble floor seeping into her very bones. She saw them all, lords and ladies in their silks and jewels, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and cruel amusement. Then she saw him. Lord Julian. He stood near a marble column, a glass of champagne in his hand, his handsome face contorted in a sneer of disbelief and disgust. Beside him, a woman of severe beauty and glacial poise, draped in diamonds that glittered like shards of ice, let out a short, sharp laugh. The Dowager Duchess of Beaumont, his mother. His mother's laughter was sharp, like the crack of ice underfoot. "Good heavens, Julian," the Duchess said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Is this the creature you've saddled us with? She looks as though she's been wrestling with pigs." Julian flushed a deep, angry red. He took a step forward, not toward Ilara, but away from her, as if to physically distance himself from her shame. "There must be some mistake," he declared loudly. "My fiancée would never present herself in such a state. This is an impostor. A madwoman. Someone see her out." The words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Impostor, madwoman. The cold that had been seeping into her feet now flooded her entire being, a paralyzing chill. The eyes of the crowd bored into her. She was a spectacle, a joke. She saw the butler motion to 2 large footmen, and she knew in that moment that she had failed. They would throw her out, and her family's last hope would be extinguished. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final, crushing humiliation. That will be enough. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the authority of a blade. It was low, calm, and held a resonance that commanded absolute attention. Ilara opened her eyes. A man had stepped out from the shadows near the far side of the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat of black superfine wool that made him seem a figure of stark simplicity amidst the glittering crowd. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on her. This was not Julian, this was his elder brother, the Duke of Beaumont. Alistair, she had never met him, but she knew of his reputation. Cold, ruthless, a man who had inherited a crumbling ducal estate at a young age and had, through sheer force of will, restored its fortunes. He was a creature of ledgers and contracts, not ballrooms. As he drew closer, she saw that his face was harsh, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, his expression unreadable. But it was his hands that caught her attention. The tips of his long, elegant fingers were faintly, but unmistakably, stained with ink. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the dark, serious intelligence in his warm brown eyes. He ignored his mother's indignant hiss, his brother's sputtering protests. He ignored the whispers that had begun to snake through the room. His focus was entirely on her. He looked at the tear in her dress, the grime on her cheek, the raw, scraped skin of her bare feet on the cold marble. He saw everything, and in his eyes she saw not disgust, not pity, but something else entirely, a flicker of recognition. He did not offer a hand, he did not say a word of comfort, he simply turned to face the room. His back now a solid wall between Ilara and the prying eyes of the world. "My brother is mistaken," the Duke announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "This is Lady Ilara Thorne. She has clearly met with some misfortune on the road, an accident that would have broken a lesser woman." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The Dowager Duchess's face had hardened into a mask of fury. Julian looked utterly bewildered. The engagement between House Beaumont and House Thorne was contracted to secure a bond between our families, the Duke continued, his voice as cool and unyielding as the stone walls around them. "Lord Julian has just demonstrated he is not fit to represent the honour of this house." He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Ilara's over his shoulder. "Therefore, the terms of the arrangement have changed." A shocked silence fell over the room. No one dared breathe. Alistair Beaumont turned back to face her fully, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. "The engagement stands," he said, his voice dropping to a level meant only for her, though everyone heard it. "But not with my brother, with me." He made a short, almost imperceptible bow. "Lady Ilara, you arrived at my home as my brothers intended. You will not leave it. You will stay as my future Duchess." For a long, silent moment, Ilara simply stared at him. The room, the crowd, his fuming mother and brother, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only this man, with his ink-stained fingers and his quiet, world-altering pronouncement. He had not rescued her, he had claimed her. In the depths of her humiliation, he had not offered a handkerchief, he had offered a coronet. It was the most bewildering, terrifying, and strangely steadying moment of her life. She was no longer a sacrifice to be endured, she was a prize to be won, and the Duke of Beaumont had just entered the contest without asking anyone's permission, least of all hers. The days that followed were a study in structured strangeness. Ilara was installed in a suite of rooms that overlooked the West Gardens, a series of chambers so vast and beautifully appointed that they felt more like a museum than a living space. A quiet, kind-faced maid, named Mary, was assigned to her, and a new wardrobe appeared as if by magic, filled with gowns of silk and muslin in muted, elegant shades that suited her far better than the fashionable pastels her own mother would have chosen. She was fed, clothed, and sheltered in the lap of unimaginable luxury. She was also utterly, profoundly alone. The Duke, her new fiancé, was a ghost. He did not call on her, he did not dine with her. He sent a note the first morning, a brief, formally worded message written in a strong, clear hand. It informed her that he was occupied with estate matters, but that she was to consider Beaumont House her home and ask for anything she required. It was signed simply, Beaumont. Ilara spent her time exploring the house like a restless spirit. She walked the long portrait-lined galleries, studying the faces of Alistair's ancestors, all of them possessing the same severe brow and determined jaw. She wandered the gardens, where the autumn air was crisp and clean. But most often, she found herself drawn to the library. It was the heart of the house, a 2-story cathedral of books, smelling of old paper, leather, and polish. It was here she felt a sliver of peace. Here she was not the mud-stained beggar or the bewilderingly acquired fiancé. She was just Elara, a woman who loved the quiet company of books. Her only human contact was with the staff, who treated her with a terrified deference, and with the Dowager Duchess and Lord Julian, who treated her with undisguised hostility. They would appear at luncheon, the only meal she was expected to take in the formal dining room, and proceed to ignore her with a theatrical precision that was more insulting than any direct comment. The Duchess would speak to her son about the appalling state of modern society, her eyes flicking to Elara as she decried grasping, low-born women. Julian would complain about his finances, lamenting how his prospects had been so cruelly dashed. Elara ate her meals in silence, her food tasteless in her mouth. She refused to let them see her crumble. She met their scorn with a quiet, unbreachable poise, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on her plate. She was a guest in their home, or rather the Duke's home, and she would conduct herself with the dignity they so pointedly lacked. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she was in the library, tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume of Virgil. She had always loved the classics, a passion her father had indulged before their finances had dwindled to nothing. She heard a soft footfall and turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, watching her. He was dressed for riding, but his boots were clean, and the ever-present ink stains on his fingers seemed fainter today. "Lady Elara," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the night of the party. His voice was just as she remembered it, low and controlled. "Your Grace," she replied, inclining her head. Her heart gave a nervous flutter. He walked toward her, his gaze falling on the book in her hands. "You enjoy the classics?" "Very much," she said. "My father taught me Latin. It was a comfort." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "This library was my father's great indulgence, and his father's before him. They collected books, but I am not certain they ever read them." His eyes scanned the shelves with an expression she could not decipher. It was not pride, but something more akin to weariness. "You are settling in, I trust?" It was a formal, meaningless question, but the way he asked it, the directness of his gaze, made her feel as though he wanted a true answer. "The rooms are beautiful. Your staff is very attentive," she said honestly. "Thank you." "It is the least you are owed after the welcome you received," he stated, a flicker of something hard in his eyes. It was the first acknowledgement of the cruelty she had faced. "My mother and brother, they are accustomed to their own way. They will adjust." Elara doubted that very much, but she said nothing. An awkward silence fell between them. He seemed as unsure of what to do in this situation as she was. He was a man of action, of decisions and decrees. Small talk was clearly not in his arsenal. "I saw you studying the architectural folios yesterday," he said abruptly, "the ones on Palladian design." Elara was startled. She hadn't realised he was aware of her movements, that he was having her watched. Or perhaps he simply noticed things. "Yes, the designs are magnificent, so balanced. There is a lesser-known volume by Isaac Ware. It is on the upper gallery, to the left of the fireplace. It contains some interesting theories on the use of light in country houses," he said. And with that, he gave another short bow and was gone, leaving her alone in the vast, silent room. She stood for a long moment, perplexed. Then, her curiosity piqued, she made her way to the upper gallery. There, exactly where he had described, was a slim volume bound in dark green leather. It had not been there that morning, she was certain of it. He had placed it there for her. It was a small thing, a nearly invisible gesture. but for Alara it was the first crack in his impenetrable armour. The cold, ruthless Duke had noticed her interest. He had taken the time to select something specifically for her. It was not a gift of jewels or gowns, things meant to adorn his future Duchess. It was a gift for her, for the woman who found comfort in old books. For the first time since her arrival, a tiny, fragile seed of something other than fear began to take root in her heart. It felt a little like curiosity. The fragile truce was shattered a week later. The Dowager Duchess, having failed to dislodge Alara through icy disdain, escalated her campaign. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, whispers that soon found their way to the local village, and, Alara was certain, beyond, they painted a picture of a desperate, scheming woman who had staged her own dramatic arrival to trap the wealthy Duke. A vulgar adventuress who had arrived with mud on her dress because it was her natural element. Alara felt the shift in the way the maids looked at her, their deference now tinged with suspicion, their kindness strained. She overheard 2 footmen murmuring in a corridor, the words guttersnipe and barefoot reaching her with painful clarity. Her quiet poise began to fray. She started taking her meals in her room again, unable to face the silent condemnation in the dining room. Worse than the Duchess's machinations were Julian's. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in her discomfort. He would seek her out when she was alone in the garden or the library, his presence a cloying mix of false sympathy and menace. "A difficult position you find yourself in, Lady Alara," he said one afternoon, cornering her near the rose garden. "My brother is not an easy man. He deals in assets and liabilities. I do hope for your sake he continues to see you as the former." "Your concern is touching, Lord Julian," Alara replied, her voice cool. He smiled, a reptilian curving of his lips. "Oh, I am concerned. For the family. We have a reputation to uphold. An alliance with a compromised entity is hardly ideal. But Alistair has always had a stubborn sense of duty. He sees a stray, he feels compelled to take it in. Just be warned, his interest in strays never lasts." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. He was telling her she was temporary, disposable. Alara's hand clenched around the book she was holding. She would not be baited. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "If you will excuse me," she said, moving to step past him. He blocked her path. "I would have been much more fun, you know," he murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Alistair will bore you to tears with his ledgers and his responsibilities. He has no capacity for joy. He crushed it out of himself years ago." That night, Alara could not sleep. Julian's words echoed in her mind, not because she believed his assessment of his brother, but because of the venom behind them. He and his mother were not merely displeased, they were actively working against her, against the Duke. She felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her. Alistair had, for his own inscrutable reasons, saved her from a terrible fate. He had shielded her, provided for her. And his family was trying to repay him with treachery. Driven by a restless energy, she slipped out of her room and made her way to the library. The house was dark and silent. A single lamp had been left burning on a large desk in the centre of the room, the Duke's desk. It was covered in stacks of papers, and in the centre lay a heavy, leather-bound book, an estate ledger. She knew she should not. It was a gross invasion of his privacy. But Julian's talk of assets and liabilities, of the family's reputation, had planted a seed of unease. She had overheard the Duchess complaining to Julian about the cost of some new stables, and Julian retorting that Alistair could squeeze a sovereign until the king's face wept. They spoke of the Beaumont fortune as if it were both infinite and under constant, miserly guard. Her gaze fell upon the ledger. Her father, in his fumbling, ineffectual way, had tried to teach her about estate management before he gave up entirely. She knew how to read a balance sheet. She knew the difference between income and expenditure. With a trembling hand, she reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with Alistair's neat, precise script. Columns of figures, notes in the margins, dates and details stretching back years. She began to read, her initial guilt giving way to a consuming focus. She saw the rents from tenant farms, the income from a coal mine in the north, the dividends from shipping investments. But as she turned the pages, a different story began to emerge. She saw huge regular payments listed under household expenses with the notation Gerber. Julian Beaumont. The sums were staggering, enough to fund a small army. Then she found other entries, notations of debts paid to London moneylenders, gambling chits settled, extravagant bills from jewellers and tailors. It was a river of gold, all flowing in one direction to Lord Julian. Further back she found even larger discrepancies, vast sums transferred to accounts belonging to the Dowager Duchess. Listed against properties that Ilara knew from her study of the estate maps were part of the original ducal entail, lands that were supposed to be preserved for the title, not sold or mortgaged. A cold knot of understanding formed in her stomach. The Duke was not hoarding the family fortune. He was desperately trying to keep it from being devoured by his own family. The ink stains on his fingers were not just from work. They were the marks of his struggle, the physical evidence of the endless, thankless task of cleaning up their mess. She was not the only one who had been trapped. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the footsteps until they stopped right behind her. An interesting choice for late-night reading, Lady Ilara. Ilara gasped, whirling around. Alistair stood there, a decanter of brandy in one hand. He was not wearing a coat, just his shirt and waistcoat, and he looked profoundly tired. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the lamplight. She expected anger, a furious outburst at her presumption. Instead, he just looked at her, his expression one of deep, abiding weariness. "Your Grace," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. I am so sorry. I should not have," he gestured to the open ledger. "There is no need to apologize. You were bound to discover the truth of this family sooner or later. It is better that you see it in ink than have it whispered to you in poisoned pieces." He walked around the desk and poured himself a small measure of brandy, his movements slow and deliberate. "My brother told you I have no capacity for joy," he stated, not a question. He is not entirely wrong. It is difficult to cultivate joy when one spends one's life plugging holes in a sinking ship. He took a sip of brandy, his eyes never leaving her face. "My father was a man of great charm and catastrophic judgment. He loved art and parties and the idea of being a duke. He did not care for the responsibilities that came with it. When he died, he left behind a mountain of debt and a title on the verge of insolvency. I was 22. I have spent the last 10 years fighting to restore what he so carelessly threw away." He fell silent, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The confession hung in the air, a raw and painful truth. This was the secret behind his cold reputation, the reason for his relentless work. He was not ruthless. He was responsible. "My mother believes the world owes her a certain lifestyle," he continued, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "And my brother believes the world owes him everything. He has the charm my father had, but none of the guilt. He is a black hole for money, for affection, for patience. Elara's heart ached for him, for the young man who had inherited a ruin and had to sacrifice his own youth to rebuild it. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. "Why did you do it? Why step in for me?" He set his glass down, the sound sharp in the silence. He looked at her, and for the first time the mask of the inscrutable Duke fell away completely. In its place was a vulnerability that stunned her. "Because I saw you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Standing in that doorway, covered in mud, with the entire world laughing at you. And you did not cry, you did not run, you just stood there, with more dignity in your ragged dress than my mother has in all her diamonds. I saw in your eyes the same trap I have been in my entire life, the duty to a family that would carelessly destroy you for its own comfort. He took a step closer. I had seen you once before, years ago, at some dreadful ball in London. You were in a corner, arguing with an old professor about Thucydides. You were vibrant and intelligent and utterly unaware of the frivolous world around you. I never forgot it. The admission struck her with the force of a tidal wave. He had remembered her. He had seen past the impoverished wallflower to the person she was. "When I saw what my brother and my mother were about to do to you," he went on, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "to crush that spirit simply because you had the misfortune of being poor and in their path, I could not allow it. It was not a calculated decision, Elara, it was an instinct. To protect something of value from being broken by those who understand only cost." He had exposed himself completely. He had handed her the truth of his family's weakness, the secret of his own long-held admiration, the painful history that had forged him. He stood before her, not as the powerful Duke of Beaumont, but as Alistair. A man as trapped by his name as she had been by hers. In that moment, she understood that his impulsive, shocking proposal had not been an act of possession. It had been an act of profound, desperate empathy. The confrontation came 2 days later. Elara had just finished dressing for dinner, her hands smoothing the deep green silk of her new gown, when a frantic knock came at her door. It was Mary, her maid, her face pale with alarm. "Your Grace," she stammered, addressing Elara with the title that still felt so foreign, "The Duke, he requests your presence in the library." Immediately, his mother and Lord Julian are with him. They are, shouting. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through Elara. This was it. The Dowager and Julian were making their move. She took a deep breath, her mind racing back to the ledger, to the columns of figures and the damning notations. She thought of Alistair's confession, of the weariness in his eyes. He had been fighting this battle alone for a decade. Not any more. She walked to the library with a calm she did not feel. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, and the Dowager's shrill voice spilled into the hall. "Absolutely will not stand for it. This farce has gone on long enough. You will break this ridiculous engagement and make a proper settlement on your brother. He has been wronged." Elara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was exactly as she had pictured it. The Dowager Duchess stood rigid with fury, her fan tapping a frantic rhythm against her palm. Julian lounged in a chair, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Alistair stood behind his desk, his face a granite mask, his hands resting flat on the surface, his knuckles white. He looked cornered. "This is a family matter," the Duchess snapped, turning her glare on Elara. "You are not welcome here." "On the contrary," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Lady Elara is the subject of this discussion. She will remain." His eyes met Ilara's, and she saw a flicker of desperation in their depths. They were threatening him, and he saw no way out that did not involve either capitulation or ruin. "It's quite simple, brother," Julian said, rising from his chair. "You stole my fiancé. You owe me. I require a significant increase in my allowance, a permanent one, and a lump sum to clear my current obligations. In return, I will graciously permit you to marry this person. Otherwise," he smiled thinly, "Mother and I might feel compelled to share our concerns about the precarious state of the Beaumont finances with certain interested parties. A run on your credit would be so unfortunate. It was blackmail, pure and simple. They would destroy his reputation, the very thing he had spent 10 years rebuilding, to get what they wanted." Alistair's jaw tightened. He was trapped between his duty to his name and the avarice of his family. Ilara stepped forward. The three of them turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from Alistair's surprise to the Duchess's pure contempt. "That will not be necessary," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady in the tense silence. She addressed Julian and his mother, but her words were for Alistair, a lifeline thrown across a chasm. "Because you will receive nothing more than the modest allowance you are currently granted, and you will be grateful for it." The Duchess let out a laugh that was more of a screech. "You dare? You, who came to this house with nothing but the dirt on your skin? You have no say in this. That is where you are mistaken," Ilara replied calmly. She walked to the desk and laid her hand on the heavy estate ledger that still lay there. "For the past 2 weeks, I have been studying the history of this estate. It is quite fascinating. For instance, I learned about the Penhurst entail." At the mention of the name, a flicker of unease crossed the Duchess's face. Julian just looked confused. The Penhurst lands were part of the original ducal entail, established in 1688. Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. "The income from them was to be used solely for the maintenance of the primary title and its holdings. They could not be sold or mortgaged, and yet I found a record of a mortgage taken against those lands 10 years ago for the sum of £50,000. A debt that His Grace," she nodded toward Alistair, "has only just managed to clear." She paused, letting the information sink in. The signature on that mortgage document was not the late Duke's. He was already incapacitated by his final illness. "The signature was yours, Your Grace," she said, looking directly at the Dowager Duchess. "It was an illegal act, forgery and fraud. The funds were transferred to a private account in your name and have been quietly spent ever since." The colour drained from the Duchess's face. Julian stared at his mother in horror. Alistair's eyes widened, a dawning realisation on his face. He had been so focused on paying the debts, he had never questioned the legality of their origin. He had been protecting his mother from a crime he never knew she committed. This was Ilara's leverage. The piece of the puzzle she had found, tucked away in a dusty annotation Alistair himself had overlooked. "So, you see," Ilara said, her voice softening slightly, "you have a choice. You can attempt to ruin the Duke's reputation, but in doing so, you will bring a scrutiny upon this family's finances that will inevitably uncover your own crime, a crime for which the penalty is not social embarrassment, but prison. She had them, utterly and completely." The power in the room had shifted, flowing away from the blackmailers and consolidating around the quiet, mud-stained woman they had dismissed as worthless. "Here are the terms," Ilara stated, taking full control. "Lord Julian will receive a final, one-time payment of £5,000, sufficient for him to travel abroad. His allowance will then cease permanently. He will not return to England for at least 5 years. You, your grace, she said to the Duchess, will retire to the Dower House. You will cease all interference in the running of this estate and in our lives. In return for your complete compliance, this unfortunate discovery will remain a private matter. Silence. The Duchess stared at her, her face a ruin of shock and impotent fury. Julian looked from his mother to Alara, the smugness wiped from his face, replaced by a craven fear. They were beaten. You will agree to this, Alistair said, his voice resonating with a newfound power. He was no longer cornered. Alara had not just given him a shield, she had handed him a sword. You will agree to Lady Alara's terms, or you will face the consequences. The choice is yours. The Duchess gave a strangled sob of rage and without another word swept from the room. Julian, after a moment's hesitation, scurried after her like a dog. The library was silent again. Alara stood with her hand still on the ledger, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alistair walked around the desk until he was standing before her. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with a profound, soul-shaking awe. You saved me, he said softly. I have been fighting them my entire life, and I have only ever been fighting to a draw. You won the war in 5 minutes. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was warm and firm. When I asked you to be my Duchess, it was an act of impulse, of desperation, an attempt to protect you. I see now how arrogant that was. I did not need to save you. You were never the one in need of saving. He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze holding hers. Alara Thorne, I am asking you again, not as a shield and not as a duty, but because you are the most intelligent, courageous, and honourable woman I have ever known. Because I have been half alive for 10 years, and you have made me feel whole in 2 weeks. Will you be my wife, my partner, my Duchess? Tears she had refused to shed in her humiliation now welled in her eyes, tears of relief, of joy. This was not a transaction. This was a true proposal, from his heart to hers. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Alistair, he smiled. A true, brilliant smile that transformed his harsh face, making him breathtakingly handsome. He gently pulled his family's signet ring, a heavy band of gold and onyx, from his own finger. It was warm from his skin. He slid it onto her finger. It was too large, but it felt like an anchor, a promise. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a polite, chaste kiss. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of desperate relief, of a love that had been waiting a lifetime to be acknowledged. It was the kiss of a new beginning. 1 year later, the Duchess of Beaumont stood by the tall windows of the Beaumont House Library, watching the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the lawn. The house felt different now. Under Alara's direction, the heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with lighter fabrics, and bowls of fresh flowers graced every room. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the quiet hum of a happy, well-managed household. It was no longer a mausoleum of past glories, but a home filled with light and warmth. Alara herself was transformed. She wore her title with an easy grace, her quiet confidence now a steady, unshakable strength. She was no longer the overlooked daughter or the desperate fiancée. She was a duchess, not just in name, but in practice. She spent her mornings with Alistair in the estate office, a small, practical room they had established off the library, poring over the very ledgers that had once been his solitary burden. Her keen mind and practical sense were the perfect complement to his disciplined approach. Together, they were not just saving the estate, They were making it flourish. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back, resting her head against her husband's chest. "Hiding from Mr. Henderson?" she murmured. The estate manager was a good man, but he could talk about crop rotation for hours. I told him we would discuss the merits of clover versus turnip tomorrow. Alistair's voice rumbled against her ear. I decided I would rather discuss my wife. He pressed a kiss to her temple. The past year had softened him. The harsh lines around his eyes had eased, replaced by the faint crinkles of frequent smiles. He was still the Duke, decisive and respected, but the cold, ruthless man the world saw was gone, replaced by the warm, loving husband Elara knew. The ink stains were often still on his fingers at the end of the day, but now she would sometimes find a matching smudge on her own. They were the marks of their partnership. "I have something for you," he said, releasing her and moving toward the desk. He picked up a slim, beautifully bound book. It was a first edition of a collection of poetry she had once mentioned admiring. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the gold leaf on the cover. "Alistair, it's beautiful. I thought it was time we added some books to this library that are meant purely for joy, not just for accounts and history," he said softly. He took her hand, the heavy signet ring on her finger glinting in the fading light. It was still a little too large, but she refused to have it altered. It was a reminder of the moment her life had truly begun. She looked around the room, at the shelves filled with stories, at the man who had become her own story. She remembered the woman who had walked through these doors, barefoot and broken, her future a terrifying blank. She had thought her life was over. In truth, it had been waiting in this room, in the heart of this quiet, steadfast man, for her to arrive and claim it. She had come to Beaumont House with nothing, and in the process had found everything. True worth, she had learned, was not something you were given. It was something you built, with courage and with love, one day, one page, one choice at a time.